That sounds fine with me. Tristan, do you want to take down that image?
Okay, welcome everybody. We're glad to have all of you with us this evening on this 75th anniversary of the atomic bombing of Nagasaki. We're gathering as we have every year since 1980 at our founding to commemorate the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on this 75th anniversary. We do this to remember what nuclear weapons represent, which is mass destruction beyond anything that human beings have ever imagined before this. A threat to life on the planet, an existential threat. And so we need to face that reality and be reminded of it so that we can continue our effort to globally abolish nuclear weapons so they can never be used again. We have an excellent program lined up for you, and the first person I'm going to call on is Dr. Zia Mian. Dr. Mian is the co-director of the Program on Science and Global Security at Princeton University, and tragically one of his colleagues, Dr. Bruce Blair, who was a major figure in the nuclear disarmament movement, died recently. So Dr. Mian, could you tell us a little bit about Dr. Blair?
Thank you, Bob. Welcome, everyone. Bruce Blair, who died on July the 19th, was a child of the nuclear age, and especially of the American nuclear age. He was born in Iowa in 1947, 2 years after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And he went to the University of Illinois, and like many young men of his generation, he joined the military, and he served in the Air Force from 1970 to 1974. Now, what was interesting for Bruce was that he actually went into the nuclear weapons part of the US Air Force. And he worked both at Strategic Command headquarters, and he trained and served as one of the missile launch officers who sit underground and turn the key when they're ordered to launch America's intercontinental nuclear missiles. And one of the things that Bruce realized was that having him, a young man barely in his 20s, sitting underground with the power to launch 50 intercontinental nuclear missiles and potentially able to launch up to 200 missiles. Each missile carried a nuclear warhead with a power 80 times the destructive energy of the Hiroshima bomb. So this 20-something young American could have unleashed violence, the like of which humanity had never seen before. Looking back on his life later, when he moved from serving in the Air Force to trying to help us all understand the dangers of what he and generations of people like him have been doing and still do today, Bruce explained something that everybody needs to understand. He says that when you are sitting down in that underground launch silo, the only thing you are trained to do is follow orders. He says, and these are his words, "We have been conditioned like Pavlov's dogs to work in a certain sequence. Everything else was above our pay grade. There was no little light of conscience. Launch officers in their early 20s, like myself, rarely struggled with the moral question of following orders that could potentially kill so many civilians. This was the nature of nuclear deterrence." So what Bruce did after leaving was he went to Yale, he got a PhD, and he tried to make the US Air Force and the US political leadership, including Congress and the public, understand just how dangerous the nuclear weapons system is that he had seen from the inside. Over and over again for decades, he tried to help Congress, policymakers, and the public and scholars who think about these things often in terms of abstractions about nuclear deterrence, understand the real mechanics and the nuts and bolts of what actually the nuclear war system, the nuclear war machine, how it actually works. And one of the things he taught us is a profound lesson that no matter what the planning about deterrence and the threats and strategies, the real danger was accidental nuclear war. Over and over again, he explained just how easy it was for the system, because of the way it was set up, both in terms of the technologies and the rules for what should be done, was that nuclear war could happen by accident. We could end the world because of an accident. And I'll just give one example of how Bruce tried to help people understand just the way that things could go wrong. In the early 1960s, even before Bruce had joined the Air Force, Robert McNamara, who was Secretary of Defense, realized that there were issues of the command and control of nuclear weapons. And he ordered that special codes be installed in the nuclear launch centers so that the missiles couldn't be launched without the proper authorization from the president and this leadership. What the Air Force did, Bruce revealed to the world, was that they said, okay, we'll install the codes, and they set all the codes to zeros. It was a sequence of 8 zeros, because they didn't want the Air Force launch officers, including Bruce when it was his turn, to make a mistake in entering the launch codes. But the Air Force never told Robert McNamara or the senior leadership that this is what they had done. They had found a way to avoid exactly the situation that the codes were supposed to do, which was to make sure that everybody followed proper authorization. Eventually, Bruce told Robert McNamara what had happened, and McNamara's answer was he was shocked and outraged. Who the hell had authorized setting the codes to zero? And what this told everybody was that the senior leadership actually didn't understand what the Air Force and the nuclear weapons operators were actually doing on a day-to-day basis to make sure that they could have control of the weapons in the way that they wanted, to make sure they would always launch and there would never be a problem. So over many years, working for Congress, and then as a scholar, as a writer, as an activist, and as a leader, Bruce tried to help people understand just how dangerous this nuclear war system had become. And he came up with many creative ideas of how to increase the time it would take to order the use of nuclear weapons, and measures to reduce the likelihood of an accidental launch of nuclear weapons. Throughout the Cold War and in the decades since the Cold War, he tried to help us come to terms with this accidental nuclear war machine. With the end of the Cold War, Bruce moved to try and push the agenda further forward than just arms control and reducing the risk of accidental war. He created Global Zero, an international movement to actually eliminate nuclear weapons. And they tried to develop a plan and a timetable for how to end nuclear weapons through a step-by-step roadmap where all the states with nuclear weapons, and there are 9 right now, would eventually agree on a treaty to remove all their weapons from a posture of first use of weapons, and then a treaty to remove all nuclear weapons from service, and then complete their permanent dismantlement by an agreed date. So Bruce laid out for us a roadmap to a world free of nuclear weapons, and it is a great tragedy for many of us working in the field of nuclear disarmament that he's not going to be with us to help us bring that vision and that goal and that possibility that he helped create for so many of us to fruition. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Meehan, and he will be missed by all of us. I know he was a great help to a number of things we did, gave talks for the Coalition for Peace Action and helped us with candidate briefings, a number of things. And it's great to have knowledgeable experts like him who took such great leadership. After our next speaker, we'll be having some music where we will be able to meditate and remember those who have died both at the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, but I'd like to invite us also to have a brief silence at that time as well in memory of Dr. Bruce Blair. So next we're going to have a person who knows up close and personal about the atomic bombing bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that is Shiho Burke. We had her with us last November for our annual conference for peace in Princeton. She gave an excellent talk there, and I'm happy to call on her again this evening. Shiho Burke.
Thank you for the Coalition for Peace Action for giving me this opportunity to speak today. My name is Shiho Burke, and my maiden name is Kikuzaki, which means chrysanthemums in Japanese. I'm the only child of two survivors of Hiroshima bombing, Toru and Mizuha Kikuzaki. At the time of the bombing, my parents were 10 years old, attending Hiroshima Kandon Elementary School. On August 6th of 1945, my mom was where she was supposed to be, which unfortunately was 1.1 kilometers away from the epicenter. My father was about 1.5 kilometers away from the blast. He was home because of the stomachache, which likely spared his life. Most of the people at the school either died from the initial explosion or within the months or years from the radiation sickness. My mom was initially trapped under the burning remains. Miraculously, the shade of light led her to climb out and escape from the debris of which once stood of her school. She had severe injuries to her scalp and arm. After her escape, she started to work toward a designated bomb shelter the students were assigned together in case of an air raid. She was stopped by Japanese soldiers who told her she was walking toward the blast center. She then walked home. Her house was standing, her mom and dad were there. Her 13 and 15-year-old brothers were forced to build plane parts instead of attending their regular schools. One of the brothers, Georgie, was badly burned. He has passed since, but I remember him from my childhood as a handsome man with an extensive scar covering his face. Her other brother, Kunihiro, took his own life after the long struggle with depression due to the loss of his father and much of his mobilities by the extensive injuries. My mom's beloved father, a government official and a prominent businessman, went his way to help others. This led him to the second exposure to the radioactive fallout, black rain. He died a few months later in October from the radiation sickness at the age of 38. The day of the bombing, my mother began having the symptoms of radiation sickness. This was the beginning of her lifelong struggle dealing with the after effects of the bombing. She had radiation poisoning, which got progressively worse until the age of 28. Her doctor pronounced her terminal and gave her 3 months to live. My mother's faith in God and will to survive led her to the embarkment on her own regimen of Eastern medicine, which she deeply credited for saving her life. After 5 miscarriages, she gave up the idea of having her own children and started the adoption process. She unexpectedly got pregnant and had me in 1974 at the age of 40. Growing up in Hiroshima and my parents' experience of the bombing has been a major feature of my own life. Daily encounter with the people whose lives have been shattered by the bombing encouraged me to talk of world peace since my early age. In 1984, Japanese director Yamada Tengo and Oscar-nominated Japanese screenwriter Shindo Kaneko allowed me to star in their movie White Town, Hiroshima, which was about the young girl whose life was forever changed by the bombing. I also traveled as a peace ambassador with TV crew to Germany, Czech Republic, Vienna, visiting various ruins of World War II, such as Terezin concentration camp, the remains of the Berlin Walls, and Hitler's last residence. We also visited the family of Czechoslovakian Jan Ratzel, the architect of the atomic bomb dome, a landmark in Hiroshima. 3/11, the news of Fukushima meltdown started to spread like a wildfire. The concern over leaving my 78-year-old mother in Japan had intensified. Exposure to excessive radiation once wasn't good enough for my mother. Now, she was facing the fatal second exposure to a dangerous level of radiation. On March 27th of 2011, 2 weeks after 3/11, I was on the plane retrieving my mother from Ground Zero. It was surprising and distressing when Japanese government was not only concealing the details of the accident, but also giving out the bogus information to their own people. The numbers in seabelts were only understood by scientists and experts. It angered me that the first nation to witness the silent suffering of the after effects of the radiation to human body, the first nation to witness the total collapse and destruction to human soul caused by the radiation, still took a risk using radiation as the energy source due to the shortage. As a parent of 3 children, the sight of mothers in Fukushima walking around with their radiation detectors to ensure the security of their children brought tears to my eyes. The recent health reports have already shown the number of Fukushima children with thyroid cancer reaching hundreds. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. Besides, the March 11 meltdown caused the extensive human sufferings, evacuations, relocations, discriminations. When does this end? Throughout mankind, we attempted to control and harness nuclear energies, but its failures ended up creating disasters from Fukushima to Chernobyl, Hiroshima to Nagasaki. After 60 nuclear bomb detonations by US Army, the Marshall Island off the coast of the Pacific is known as Nuclear Tomb. The pits containing more than 3.1 million cubic feet of radioactive materials were sealed back in the 60s. Now, this irreversible past is coming back to haunt us. There are major concerns over the cracks of these pits and the leakage of the nuclear materials. This is another Fukushima waiting to happen on the island of 60,000 people. Knowing the unforeseen accidents and unfortunate tragedies we may likely to face in the future, we can't justify using a nuclear energy or nuclear weapons. Knowing the long-term effects of physical and mental damages we have to endure, we have no choice but to seek other solution for energy and the weapon of our choice. We can't change the past or take back the mistakes we have already made, but we can indeed change the future by not repeating our mistakes. Nuclear disarmament of not just America or Japan, but everywhere on this earth is a hard goal to reach, but it must be achieved. Elie Wiesel once said, "To forget the Holocaust is to kill twice." Well, to forget any of these events is to kill twice. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to tell you about my experience with the effects of this tragic event. Now it's your job, your children's job, and even your grandchildren's job to preserve these memories, as we cannot forget what happened on that fatal day 75 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shiho, for that comprehensive and moving overview of the nuclear danger that still faces us today. We're going to have questions through the chat box for both Shiho and Dr. Ellsberg at the end. So if you have any for Shiho, you could start putting those up there. But I think the thing we wanted to do next was have a contemplative moment, little interlude of about 3 minutes. And during that 3 minutes, Tristan will be playing for us a recording of the shakuhachi, which is the Japanese flute. It's a very beautiful, touching piece of music. So Tristan, could you play that for us? It'll last about 3 minutes. Thanks to Glenn Swan for that beautiful, reflective and mournful piece of music. It's now my honor to introduce our keynote speaker for this evening's commemoration, and it's somebody who needs very little introduction because I'm sure all of you have heard of Dan Ellsberg. Dr. Ellsberg, of course, became quite famous around the Pentagon Papers, and he has continued to be a shining light of living a life of conscience, in my judgment, and has been a whistleblower on many issues, including nuclear weapons issues. In fact, his latest book called The Doomsday Machine, Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner, I found to be a very compelling case for why we must intensify our efforts to abolish nuclear weapons everywhere. So it's my great honor to turn over the mic to Dr. Daniel Ellsberg. And as I said, we'll have Q&A right after his talk for him and for Shiho via the chat box, or I think there's a mechanism on Facebook as well if you're watching that way. Dr. Ellsberg.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to join very much in the tribute to Bruce Blair, my friend, who, having been involved in a process that might have ended most organized life on Earth, most organized human life on Earth, as I was, he in a missile control silo, I in drafting guidance for the possible launch of those missiles earlier that he was working on. He changed his life and spent the rest of his life trying to warn people about the extreme dangers of our then current and now current deployment of nuclear weapons and the nuclear policy that goes with them. And I too have tried to spend my life, but that subtitle of the book just mentioned, Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner, is not merely a rhetorical flourish on the past. It is a matter for confession and for acknowledgement that what I was involved in was deeply wrong. And what Bruce was involved in was deeply wrong. And he saw that, and as I say, spent the rest of his life, in effect, subject to what's sometimes known as the survivor syndrome of, as the Hibakusha are, of trying to warn people about something of which they are insufficiently concerned. When the atomic bomb dropped on August 6th, 1945, that's often described as the greatest devastation that had been inflicted on humans in warfare. That's not true. It not only wasn't that, it wasn't the greatest destruction that the United States had inflicted on Japanese in that war. To this day, I think very few people seem aware that in terms of killing civilians by the tens and even hundreds of thousands, that was not a new policy initiated in August of 1945. It was, of course, initiated to a considerable degree by Japanese on Shanghai as early as 1932, and again later in Chongqing, by the Nazis in Guernica, along with Mussolini's forces, and then again in the Battle of the Blitz over London, where the attempt was to kill as many civilians in London as possible. Earlier, there'd been Rotterdam and Warsaw under slightly different conditions. All that was seen as contrary to what President Roosevelt had defined on the beginning day of the war, the attack into Poland on September 1st, as inhuman barbarism against all values and norms of civilization. He actually called on all the participants to refrain in it, President Roosevelt. And one of the first to agree, actually, was Hitler, who hadn't yet engaged in the Blitz, or the others. Britain joined that somewhat reluctantly because some of their bomber people had in mind actually destroying cities as their contribution to the war. By the end of the war, the British now had for 3 years been firebombing cities at night. No discrimination other than the fact of a city. Built up areas, in particular workers' housing, killing as many civilians as possible. We abhorred, the US abhorred such practices at first, calling them literally baby killing. And moreover, a diversion of resources from either preparing for an invasion or the air use against transportation, oil, which actually was effective against Hitler's ground operations in a way that the bombing of cities was not. And some 600,000 German civilians had been killed by 1945, by the end of the war, contributing, as the US Strategic Bombing Survey concluded, virtually nothing to the shortening of the war. The US, as I started to say, had joined them in this effectively by the end of 44, and in particular in Japan. After the night of March 9th, 10th in 1945, virtually our only targets under General May in the Pacific were Japanese cities. Actually, Admiral Halsey from carrier forces deplored again such diversion of resources. He concentrated on transportation with some considerable effect. The burning of the cities had no effect on the war aims of the war party, the war faction in Japan, or in shortening the war. But the beginning of that campaign, March 9th, 10th, the incendiary campaign killed more people in one night than either of the atomic bombs later, which constituted the second and third largest terrorist attacks in human history. In fact, came close in one night to doing as much as both of the atomic attacks did initially in the first night together. So in terms of a turning point in the willingness of American leaders, civilian and military, to pursue war by the Nazi tactics and the Japanese tactics of killing civilians, and that was not the principal tactic of the Nazis. They never relied on it that much. It became a principal tactic of our Air Force, as I say, in Europe in 44, and Japan totally in 45. Again, with virtually no effect on the shortening of the war, and that was fairly obvious as the war went on. There was no change in the position of the willingness to fight. The Battle of Okinawa, with enormous casualties, came after all of that. So it's pretty evident to all that it wasn't having an effect and was hardly intended to have the effect of shortening the war. It was particularly intended to show the role of the Air Force in the support of the B-29 project in the post-war planning. Those were essential motives for the Air Force at that time for doing what they could do, which was bombing of cities as a whole, causing firestorms, rather than what they couldn't do, which was getting through clouds and battling very heavy airstreams in the time and hitting precision targets, which had been the earlier objectives. So in terms of changing the world, as Hiroshima is often described, it's really urgent to look at how the world did change and how it didn't change. The prospect of nuclear war changed less, in a way, than almost anyone expected when it occurred, less than what was urgently needed up till this day, and really, strikingly, much less than people could imagine. Einstein said in 46, "The unleashed power of the atom has changed everything save our modes of thinking, and thus we drift towards unparalleled catastrophe." Now, the possibility of catastrophe, she posed, and which scientists had foreseen from the beginning of the Manhattan Project as a possibility, has remained as a possibility, and if anything, grown within years and a decade or so into not world-destroying, human-destroying in terms of extinction, but civilization-destroying capabilities, and not only possessed by us, but by others, in particular the Russians, and to a lesser degree the Indians and Pakistani and others who have these weapons, but in We have 90% of them, and our targeting has always been such on both the US and Russian sides as to burn cities in a way which only 40 years after Hiroshima we realized scientific efforts would have an effect that had been ignored up till that time, and that was to loft smoke and soot from the burning cities, and we targeted hundreds, even 1,000 of those, whether or not they were explicitly targeted or whether it was military targets allegedly inside the city or near the city. The smoke from those would be lofted into the stratosphere where they would not burn out, fall out from rain. Fallout is radioactivity that doesn't go to the stratosphere on the whole, and it doesn't cross oceans really very much. But the smoke in the stratosphere would encircle the globe and would cut out 70% of the sunlight. This is from either the US or the Russian plan, and cause a nuclear winter that would destroy harvests, freeze lakes, freeze rivers, and starve nearly everyone to death, with global supplies of food lasting perhaps 60 days for the whole planet, but that's heavily concentrated in some countries like our own, which would not export anything, but would last somewhat longer, a matter of months, before they too, we too, were starved to death by our own attack. Likewise for the Russians. I say to a lesser degree, the Indians and Pakistanis, but they too already have the capability, even without a stock of hydrogen bombs, only with their atomic bombs, could starve up to 2 billion or more people by now. That attack.
Hey, Dan, your camera's off.
Yes,
Hello?
I was going to mention that.
I'm sorry?
You seem to have turned off your video, Dan, so we can't see you.
Sorry? Really? I'm pushing it here. I'm not getting it. You're not missing much, of course. Can you hear me? I'm punching the start video, but nothing happens. I don't know what's the matter here.
Nikki, anything, or Tristan, can we help Dr. Ellsberg here?
Okay, is it worth, I'll go out for a minute and start again or something? I don't know, it's just.
No, I'd say keep going. It was just if you could do it easily. Just keep going then, Dan.
Okay. Modes of thinking, Einstein said. And I've long thought, is thinking the issue here? Or should we say concern, morality, our norms, our modes of judging and evaluating, and above all, our concern about people on the other side of the earth, or people even nearer, who are described, defined as enemies, or people we needn't care about. When I was, in my role, comparable to Bruce Blair, involved in this process, back in 1961, I'll continue to click here and hold it, doesn't do anything. Okay. My role was to draft, at one point in 1961, guidance for the annual operational plans of the Strategic Air Command and the Navy, for that matter, Polaris. The operational plans for general war. In the course of that, I asked, I drafted a question which the President sent to the Joint Chiefs in his own name, to the Joint Chiefs, asking them how many would die if we carried out our war plans, which then, as now, were primarily plans for preemption or escalation, not for retaliating to an attack on the United States, but rather the bulk of our weapons was always addressed to limiting damage in the event of a nuclear war. That remains true to this day, by attacking the forces of the other side, disarming them to the degree that we could, which was not then great enough to destroy, to protect us from absolute devastation. But anyway, do what we could, in effect, or to carry out our commitments to Europe and elsewhere to initiate nuclear war and to deter the Russians from responding to our first use, which we are then and now committed to use when necessary in repelling some attack or invasion, to deter, let's say, the Russians, they were the designated enemy here, then and now, from responding with second use by the threat that we would escalate to a first strike, to a preemptive strike, all-out war. So the question was, striking first then, not having been degraded by their attack, with all our forces, how many would die? And I go in some detail in the book as to the successive answers to this. But the bottom line was that the answer was 600 million. 600 million. 100 holocausts. And I thought then that that plan that answer that I was getting designated an evil plan. And I knew that it was not some hypothetical future notion of a war, a Star War kind of thing far in the future. It was the operational plan in case war broke out, as it was threatened that very year in 1961 by Berlin, over Berlin, or the next year in Cuba, such a plan. And they envisioned in a plan and prepared for 600 million. Now that was wrong even then because it didn't take account of fire, which was too hard to calculate. That would have raised the effects of our own attack to about 1 billion. However, the rough fallout, rather than the fire, would spread to our own allies, and in that 600 million was included 100 million allies. The NATO allies that we were supposedly protecting would be killed by fallout from our own attacks. Moreover, another 100 million from in India, northern India, Afghanistan, and Austria, various neutrals that were contiguous to the Soviet bloc. All right. The idea then that humans like myself, friends of mine, people I knew and worked with, had made a plan like that posed me a question that I've lived with the rest of my life. There was a question that these people were in some sense, I couldn't imagine, different from me. I didn't regard myself as a monster working on these plans. I was trying to deter Soviet attack. I thought, well, no. But in any case, let's just say, I learned then and I learned later that it doesn't take monsters to plan and even carry out a monstrous act, a monstrous effect. Let me also point out that we've been talking about nuclear winter. We didn't know then for another 20 years that the burning of these cities would cause what I describe as the effect from the smoke of killing nearly everyone on Earth and making extinct nearly every other large species because they can't adapt to the extent that we can by moving thousands of miles, by fire, by housing, by ventilation, by all kinds of things. The other species would go extinct when we did not, but it would kill perhaps 90 to 98% of humans. And that could happen like this year over a war that started over the Ukraine or the Baltics, conceivably Syria. Iran perhaps is a more likely war before this, which would not immediately go nuclear because like Japan, they are not a nuclear state. So that would be more limited. It would be a massacre, absolutely unconscionable war crime, but it wouldn't probably lead to blowing up the world. Other events could, for which we've prepared enormously, as we have for the last 75 years. As Bruce said, I agree with him that the war, when it comes, would probably be not by the clear-headed, calm, reflective decision of a head of state, but by some panicked, desperate act, or even an unauthorized act by some subordinate, which could have happened in the past, or a false alarm, which led, as our planning requires, to the launch of our ICBMs, our intercontinental ballistic missiles, rather than lose them, use them rather than lose them. Why? On the delusional, absolutely delusional belief that has persisted for 70 years, that it's better to go first than second. And in the light of nuclear winter in particular, which is 35 years old, That's absolutely delusional. And yet it's a profitable delusion on both sides. We both have, I'm talking Russia and the US here, and the other countries, have military industrial complexes that do profit from preparing for this possibility. Now, when Reagan and Gorbachev agreed on what Reagan had said actually a couple of years earlier, nuclear war cannot be won and must not be fought. Some people, in fact, I can quote right now, some reports that have just come out say it's important for Putin, Trump, or his successor to make that declaration again. Unfortunately, that's infinitely far from enough. When Reagan and Gorbachev made that statement, they were both in the state of enlarging their nuclear forces, especially the periods in Russia before that. But Reagan was in the largest buildup since Kennedy, the largest one until the current Obama-Trump buildup. And it did not pause for a second after making that proposal, that statement, cannot be won and must not be fought. What that statement left out was, it must not be threatened, it must not be prepared for, it must not be launched in preemption or in a supposed damage limiting form, since damage limiting is as delusional as winning. Prevailing likewise. In the famous statement of Thomas Power, the successor to Lemay at SAC, if 2 Americans and 1 Russian survive the war, we've won. Definition of basically, more precisely, if we have more nuclear missiles, more capability to destroy after this vast exchange, that will be prevailing. That is, as I say, delusional, and very obviously delusional. Can professionals actually persist and pervade and act on delusions like that for a prolonged period? Look at the pandemic right now. We have a national party in the majority, which acts aggressively on the belief, the maintained belief, that man-made or human-made anthropocentric climate change is a hoax, or at any rate, not anthropogenic, not man-made. So we're seeing the practical effects of that, and I could go through every crisis in history practically and show how delusions like that have pervaded. Now, going back to Hiroshima, actually, I'm saying then there was no real change at that time. Hiroshima did not represent a change in the readiness and willingness of American leaders to annihilate overnight hundreds of thousands of people. We had been trying for 5 months before Hiroshima to kill as many Japanese civilians as we could, day after day, and we had done about, by one calculation, 900,000, to which McNamara agreed in a fog of war. Others less, 600,000, 900,000 before the 300,000 eventual casualties of the 2 atom bombs. So what had changed? Well, there was in fact what President Obama proposed briefly when he spoke at Hiroshima, for the first American president who was there, saying, a future we can choose in which Hiroshima and Nagasaki are known not as the dawn of atomic warfare, but as the start of our own moral awakening. And as he said earlier in that same lecture on May 2016, yes, what is needed, the scientific revolution led to the splitting of an atom, requires a moral revolution as well. And that's what, in effect, Einstein was pointing to. Gandhi, when he heard of the Hiroshima attack, says that he was just transfixed for some period. He couldn't move, he was silent. He didn't talk. He thought of it as the most diabolical act of scientists that the world had seen. And he said, what it has done to the soul of a destroying nation is yet too early to see. That was in 1945. 75 years later, it's not too late, too early, certainly, to see. It is time to take stock. Was it the beginning of a moral awakening, a moral revolution? No. Flatly, we can say no. Was there a debate for a while? Yes, there actually was a good deal of scruple and condemnation even, especially from religion, on this question, which could and should have been applied to the firebombing before it, both in Germany and in Japan, which had been criticized by a handful of individuals, but not generally at all. There was no moral issue for Truman and Stimson and others, moral issue in deciding not to interfere with the plans for using 2 bombs against Japan, because there was no moral difference between that and the killing of hundreds of thousands we'd been doing for 5 months. It just was more efficient, looking at the short term. Whatever the aims were, you could not say that was more of a crime than what had been done to Tokyo and elsewhere, or less of a crime. To say, yes, there was radiation poisoning, which was new, yes, a bad way to die, like being burned to death or dying of a fire, as in Tokyo and elsewhere. I won't go into that, but almost too crucial, but too ghastly. Mention one point that isn't in people's minds. The difference between Tokyo and Hiroshima was that Tokyo is crisscrossed with canals, like Venice, you might say. People left their shelters. If they stayed, the oxygen was all burned up by the firestorm and they suffocated, as in Dresden. If they went through the streets, the asphalt was burning, so they couldn't move. They were caught in the asphalt like burning torches. Children were plucked from their arms, literally, this happened, by the hurricane of fire, went into the flames. But many people did what they could to get to the canals. And they went in to the canals to escape the flames. But the canals were boiling. So tens of thousands of people boiled to death. There's really no way to say that Hiroshima was worse than Tokyo. It was not less bad. It was not better. It was not worse. And so they were both horrific criminal massacres and immoral. What happened, though, when Stimson and others succeeded in the next year, a year after Hersey's article, in explaining with an entire web of lies the supposed rationale for our dropping the atom bomb. He didn't try to apologize for the earlier firebombing because Americans were hardly conscious of that at all. And when they did hear of it, they thought wrongly that it had been aimed at military targets. Hiroshima, you couldn't explain that way. So Stimson came right out and said, yes, 100,000 people, civilians and so forth, were killed. Terrible. But then he went on to give a number of reasons why that was a lesser evil, a necessary evil, that had actually, compared to the alternatives, saved lives from an invasion, which was supposedly the only alternative way to end the war other than the atom bomb on our terms, which allowed keeping the emperor. That was false. Nearly everybody involved knew that everything he'd said there basically was false. But the American people accepted that there had been circumstances in which it was legitimate, moral, and even necessary to kill 100,000 people. Not talking about the 900,000 for which there was no better excuse earlier than the atom bomb. They thought, okay, this one had been necessary. And what that meant was two things. It could be necessary again. A president should not be deprived of that instrument. That was the immediate cause for causing this propaganda. Should not be deprived of using this instrument as a point of threat and possible use in the future. And second, the leaders had been responsible, had been reflective, had calculated, looked at the alternatives, that's what Simpson said, and had reluctantly agreed to this. In short, you could trust Americans leaders in secret to make this decision. Now that was all false, but it did reassure people, as I said, and they pretty much turned away from it until the question of atmospheric testing arrives, and then for brief periods during the Cuban Missile Crisis and elsewhere, there have been flurries of concern about what was going on. But on the whole, we've left it to our leaders to make these decisions. Surprisingly, to the scientists, and I could say to myself, the explosions on people haven't occurred again for 75 years. I did not predict at the time that that was possible, that this race could go on for 75 years and not explode. Do we conclude from that then that it really wasn't dangerous, that things didn't have to change, there didn't have to be a moral revolution? Because certainly there hasn't been. Obama, near the end here, Obama raised the question that when we look at the possibilities here, the souls of Hiroshima speak to us. They ask us to look inward to take stock of who we are and what we might become. Well, who we are people who believe that killing the 100,000 people in Hiroshima specifically was justified, was an appropriate act for American leadership, and could be again. And we have lived now not with a recurrent set of explosions on people since then, which would have happened had the threats our leaders have made in secret numerous times been carried out. But they have lived, we have lived, with a situation in which most of the human species can be extinguished by our own actions any time. Tomorrow, next month, before the election, after the election, doomsday machines, in short, that are in both the US and Russia. It's true of the Russians as well, true of everybody under the threat of an India-Pakistan war, that and a supposed inadvertent war can occur. Doomsday machines can go off that kill nearly all of us. And pretty much everybody lives with this. Some of us, quite a few people on this program and others, have spent our lives trying to reduce that danger, but ineffectively. The danger has not been reduced. And it's what it was 50 years ago, which was already the capability of causing firestorms that would destroy most life on Earth. So the question to us then is what we might become. Is a moral awakening possible? That remains to be seen. We haven't seen it. It hasn't happened yet. And yet, as humans, can we then, can I act as if it's impossible? No, things aren't that certain as to what's possible, what isn't possible. The odds are against us changing it. The odds in this country of opposing Lockheed, General Dynamics, Boeing, Raytheon, who make these weapons, not to make them, is not much greater than considering or convincing Exxon and Aramco and Chevron and the others to leave the oil in the ground, which is essential for the survival of our current civilization, and is probably not going to happen. And we're probably not going to change this. And yet, here is a motive for continuing to vote ourselves. First of all, the practical one of wanting civilization to survive, which is possible later, but unlikely as we're now going. And it's an incentive to try to awaken the souls of America and of Russia and of the other nations and the 30 nations that rely on American threats of nuclear war in NATO and elsewhere for their supposed protection, to recognize this. And with this grim thought.
Thank you, Dr. Ellsberg. I would like to wrap up in a moment and I'll open it up to questions and answers if this is a suitable place for you to have that happen. Okay?
Yep.
I thought it was a deeply probing speech, and I appreciate it very much. It certainly triggered a lot of thoughts in my mind, but I'd like to turn now to Tristan and Nikki to say, could you all present some of the questions, grouping them if possible, or if necessary, for Shiho and for Dr. Ellsberg?
Sure, yeah, we have a couple questions. Any more can go into the chat box, or if you want to use the raise hand feature, if you know how to use that. So the first question we got was from Julia. How do we get nuclear weapons away from each country? So I guess commenting on what abolition and like the different treaties looks like.
Who is that to? Shiho or whoever?
It was just generally directed.
Shiho, do you want to comment on that? Or I'm willing to, yeah, either way. Okay. Of course, it follows from what I've been saying, I think, that it has been misplaced to trust any humans that have been in power or not in power with appropriate control of these weapons. That is the elimination of the weapons. President after president and others have said that they want to eliminate the world and have done essentially, of nuclear weapons, and have done essentially nothing to do that. Yes, reductions have been made, even 90% of the warheads. That sounds significant, except that that's far more than is necessary or likely in the event of war to wipe us all out. We still have more than enough to cause nuclear winter on alert, on hair trigger. So I would say, in a movement, pressing on our representatives in Congress, those who are not totally beholden to, on the one hand, Boeing and Raytheon, and on the other hand, Exxon for the climate problem, to, I'll say very practically, get rid of the hair trigger as the highest priority, get rid of the use them or lose them ICBMs, which give the president or the prime minister, the premier in Russia, less than 10 minutes to decide on destroying most of civilization. Get rid of those. And there is some move to do that in Congress, and various people have actually proposed it, including, by the way, Senator Ed Markey, and a number, about 10 other senators, not enough to do it yet, Bernie Sanders, and others you can find on that. Second, to enormously reduce the number sufficient of new warheads in every country, starting with us and Russia, to produce nuclear winter. Now, what does that get you down to? Well under 100 each, and we have more than 1,500 on alert right now on each side. No country can justify, I would say, the number of weapons it actually has right now. None of the 9, with the possible exception of North Korea, which, limited by coming late to the race, has maybe at the most 60 weapons. Everybody else, at most, they probably have more like 20 in operation. But every other of the 9 countries has more than that, and not one of them can actually justify it. And let me say one last thing on the question of justifying. It's very hard to compare actually deliberately killing 100,000 people or 900,000 people or 6 million in the Holocaust or 60 million with deliberate actions to risk, prepare, threaten killing 7 billion. Hard to compare. But let me say the latter, which we've done for half a century, is not less evil than actually killing 100 million. Both, you can say 100,000. You can say 6 million is even worse than 5 million or 100,000 or so. That's a comparison perhaps you can make. Both evil, obviously. I repeat, risking 7 billions is not quite as easy to compare. It's not less evil. And to say that it is evil is to say We were criminal. We did an evil action. As ordinary Americans did this, like you and me. They weren't more evil as persons than anybody else, but what they did was wrong, and has been wrong every year since, and is deeply wrong now. And that means that it deserves a willingness to expose and oppose and resist these actions.
Thank you, Dr. Ellsberg. We want to get a few more questions in before our time is up. We're aiming to end at about 8:15 Eastern here. So Nikki or Tristan, another question? Tristan, unmute yourself.
It went for short here, I'm sorry.
Usually
I can hold it. Huh?
I was just going to read this question out. This one specifically for Dr. Ellsberg. How do you envision a moral awakening taking place before we end civilization through a nuclear war, and what can we, the people, do to help that moral awakening take place?
There have been movements that have had an effect, simply not sufficient and not prolonged enough, but have made a significant effort. Millions of people took part in marches and demonstrations, and hundreds of scientists and insiders protested and exposed atmospheric testing and, let's say, the absolute delusional aspect of Star Wars, of SDI, strategic, enough to stop the testing atmospherically, to give it, we would be testing right now and would have been had it not been for such a movement. And the Trump administration is talking, as Trump himself has said, he's considering renewing testing right now, which would mean that India and Pakistan would have, instead of atomic weapons, which would allow them to kill maybe half of humans in firestorms and the smoke that was caused, but thermonuclear weapons, which they don't have yet operationally, which would give them a full doomsday effect. So the idea then of public protest, we've just seen now Black Lives Matter. We'll see, it's as big a movement as we've ever seen. And at the risk of COVID, not only to the people, but I have to say uneasily to the people they're in contact with. Nevertheless, it has changed. Is there a moral awakening on the issue of slavery and the issue of what followed slavery, Jim Crow, and the US history on this? Absolutely. I don't think I've seen a change in opinion on that respect in my lifetime. I mean, with the exception of gay rights, actually, a fairly amazing change literally in people's moral judgments. So it is possible to see a movement like Black Lives Matter or the anti-war movement with civil disobedience, as is going on, with demonstrations, but with pressure on Congress, above all, with the necessity of getting rid not only of the Trump administration, but of the Republican majority in the Senate. Does that solve the nuclear problem? Absolutely not. Biden has gone along with that, as have all the Democratic leaders, including Obama, reluctantly. Does there need to be a movement of resistance to get Biden, after he's elected, which I would say is an essential aspect if we're to change the situation? It's just the beginning. There has to be pressure on him to go against his natural instincts, I would have to say, and his other people, like possibly Susan Rice or Michelle Flournoy or others in the Defense Department. Their instincts are to do what the military-industrial complex wants. That is not trustworthy. It is not right. And finally, as I say, Lincoln caused secession by expressing the opinion that slavery was wrong. He said, if slavery is not wrong, then nothing is wrong. Well, I would say right now, if spending $2 trillion, to modernize over 30 years a doomsday machine is not wrong, then nothing is wrong. It is as wrong as slavery, and we are seeing a reawakening on that issue. So I can say I'm working in hope that that can be roused on the issue of doomsday.
Thank you, Dr. Ellsberg. Tristan, did you have a question to put?
No, not really. I mean, Nikki got the one that I was looking at.
Okay, Nikki, any more? I wanted to make a closing remark at the very end, but any other questions?
I think we've covered them unless...
I see one for Shiho. What was the natural therapy that saved your mother, is the question. Unmute yourself, Shiho. Can you unmute yourself, Shiho?
Sorry.
There you are. Okay.
Okay. So she had her brother, her stepbrother was an Eastern medicine doctor. So she went on the natural diets, like just the fruits. She actually had to spend about 3 years just eating vegetables and fruits because she was getting a lot of side effects from all the Western medication she had been on for years when she was told she was terminal. So that pretty much my mom always had to believe those 3 years of just cleansing herself had saved her life. That's the answer to that, yes.
Thank you, Shiho. And we're going to move toward our closure here. I want to just share one closing thought. I found Dr. Ellsberg's talk very insightful and challenging, and it reminded me of an episode that I had with a conversation with the former Chief of Army Chaplains, Reverend Johnson, a number of years ago. And the Roman Catholic bishops had their letter on War and Peace come out in 1983. It was very big news, front page news, actually made a big difference with people in the pews of Catholic churches. It showed that it made them move much more toward peaceful attitudes. But it endorsed the nuclear freeze, which was the big campaign at the time. But it said that in the meantime, the United States could hang on to its nuclear weapons indefinitely as long as it was moving toward trying to discuss getting rid of them. So Kermit Johnson, again, former Chief of Army Chaplains, was in the steam room in the Pentagon with then Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger shortly after the letter was issued. And he saw Weinberg's grinning and smiling. And he asked him, "What are you so happy about, Secretary Weinberg?" And Weinberg said, "They said we could keep them." And this is part of the problem. And I want to say, as a faith leader myself, that the faith community has sometimes been very slow on this. We're supposed to be moral leaders, but often we have not been, and have endorsed war in various forms and violence, including the possession of nuclear weapons. And so there has been an awakening, but it's been very slow. The United Methodist bishops in 1987 did come out with a much stronger document called In Defense of Creation, where they said possessing nuclear weapons was a sin. And Pope Francis said that just last November in Nagasaki. So I hope that the faith community and all people of conscience will move in this direction, because I think Dr. Ellsberg was right on target to be threatening these monstrous weapons, to use them, to be saying this is our source of security, is really just basically permitting a doomsday machine to keep us under constant threat of annihilation of all life. So we, on this 75th anniversary, I encourage you to recommit yourself to this struggle. to reduce and abolish nuclear weapons everywhere. We've had some fantastic leaders. Dr. Blair has been mentioned. Dr. Ziamian was the scientific advisor to the nuclear ban treaty passed in the United Nations in 2017. Dr. Ellsberg is a very long time and very deeply insightful leader on this as well. So we appreciate all of you being with us. This video will be posted on our website. By the way, the anecdote I shared, as well as some other reflections on the faith community's roles, is in a recorded sermon that I was used this morning in churches around the country, including one in Princeton's Christ Congregation. So go to our website, peacecoalition.org. If you're on our email list, you'll be getting the links for tonight's event as well as next steps. We have a number of things already listed under Take Action. I hope you'll look at that carefully, especially our peace voter alerts, so that we can maximize our impact in the upcoming election. Again, our deep appreciation to Dr. Ziamian, to Shiho Burke, and to Dr. Daniel Ellsberg. We appreciate all of you being with us this evening. We had over 150 people signed up to participate both on Zoom and Facebook live stream. And so we really appreciate your being with us. Stay tuned and have a good rest of your evening. Take care.